in that I was talking with Josiah before we started here, and we're going to get into some soil testing, and I'm going to take a stab and guess that most, if not some, of you out there have gotten soil testing before, and it's a it's not a criticism directly, but it's a bit, most of the extension outlets and the soil testing labs, and there's some really good ones out there, so just like there's good doctors, but it's a bit like going to the doctor and getting a pill rather than changing your diet and taking a probiotic. It's a really good way to make the analogy. I think most are aware that Western medicine it's kind of a rescue approach more so than a proactive approach. So, bioenergetic agriculture, progressive farming, these kinds of regenerative practices are thinking forward, right? We're trying to set the system up to be the system that it can be, rather than manage all of the problems that rear their heads, which incidentally are all created by the act of agriculture, which is innately a manipulative exercise, right? So what I'm going to try to do is get across probably a little bit of a different philosophy if you have done soil testing than you've seen before. And, I kind of try to walk the line of not being too technical versus getting the point across. So hopefully I can do that adequately. If there are questions, obviously, let me know and we can get into the ring on it. But soil is a very dynamic thing. And so, let's start with there. What is soil? If you look up a literal definition, it's the upper layer of earth in which plants grow, a black or dark brown material, typically consisting of a mixture of organic remains, clay, and rock particles. It's about as general as you can get. It's also about as good as you can get. It's an undefinable thing in the sense of what it is when it works together. Sort of like saying forest. Is it a temperate forest? Is it a tropical forest? Is it what is it? Or saying water. Water's never the same. We're saying love or compost, or there's a limitation of language, right? So it's understandable that there's different languages and different approaches of how to manage it, just like there is in medicine. It's understandable that doctors that go to a lot of school to learn the technicality of how to manage disease aren't really in the posture of how to prevent it, So, don't take anything that I'm saying here as a judgment. It's more of just, let's be real, right? And let's be big boys and girls and not be offended by it. On some level, all we're trying to do is be good and do better, So, soil, in what I've come to and trying to think about how to communicate what soil is that it's a physical, mineral, biological, and energetic entity. That's it's alive. That's what bioenergetic is discussing and putting into action methods of which we can work with these components of the living system. And as I've described, conventional agriculture is physical and it's mineral. You plow and you fertilize, generally. Then you try to kill back all the problems that are created. Organics brings in the biological. I would argue passively. There's no discussion of any earnestness about microbial diversity in the soil, for example. And both conventional and organic completely ignore the energetic capacity of life, the life force, if you will. The concept of there being more to life than what's physically here, that we're more than the sum of our parts. Biodynamic methods do a really good job of addressing this component, but in and of itself are not a complete farming system. And that is really where bioenergetics comes from. It's an effort of trying to create a landscape that can meet everybody where they are and challenge them to take steps to regenerate the landscape into the balance and health that it can ensue with proper management. In a quick way of saying it's trying to get the human out of the way as much as possible. So that all starts in between the ears, So, this is I've shown you this before. This is kind of a schematic of some of the things that we remain conscious of as we're approaching an agricultural situation. But, soil is balance in motion. It is undefinable. And in all reality, any measurement that you take of it is only a snapshot, and we really need to come to terms with that. It's really, I can recall when I ran my retail store, getting the architect in there wanting to start a square foot garden, and he'd gridded out his 4x8 bed in very specific squares and spaced everything perfectly. And you know, it's a starting point. It kind of makes you chuckle though once you get into it. It's like, how do you really manage it from that level? So, you know, invite you to kind of geek out on the analytics of this, but just take it for what it's worth and let go of the exactness in it. It's a range approach. Now we know what to add and what not to, and then we can help you get into the detail of how much and things like that. But it's important not to take this as an equation. You know, I mean, life is alive, you know, like I said. So just take a quick look at this this video. It's kind of cool to see, and you know, we'll get into some really neat things in regards to the soil food web as we go here. This is just a petri dish of fungi and some bacteria, and it just kind of gives you a window into the universe of the soil food web. There's literally another universe under our feet, or there should be, right? A lot of chemically treated landscapes and you know, developed property are completely devoid of the proper diversity of life to really call soil soil. Like I always say, try drinking a beer without yeast, right? It's not a beer, and it's the same with soil, but it's based on a greater diversity of microbes, not unlike the ocean, right? It's the trophic levels, the big fish, the plankton, all the way up to the shark, and everything in between provides the nourishment for the system, and it maintains itself. We don't have to stock the ocean. Again, our exercise there is kind of to get the human out of the way. But look at this image. You know, these bacteria are using this fungi as kind of a highway. And in a lot of ways, the fungi are kind of the neural network of the soil and communicate along, you know, tremendous distances. I think the largest organism in the world is a honey mushroom out in Oregon. I think it's in a beech forest. But it's really cool that you can see the cytoplasmic flow through the fungal hyphae. And it, you know, again, just gives you an idea that there's a lot more going on than meets the eye. You know, this concept of, let's see, how do I get back to the show here? Why is that not coming back up for me? Just how do I? Well, sorry guys.
You might want to try just go into stop share. There you go.
Oh, there you go. All right, let's share it again. All right, so essentially, you've got this activity in the soil. We'll get into the details of the food web in a minute. I just kind of wanted to provide that visual. And you know, let's just kind of get to some quick terms. You know, soil, there's more going on than meets the eye. Soil operates on a completely different scale than, you know, our visual experience and our materialistic experience. And this is, you know, to start with, a lot of the reasons people aren't aware that the soil is alive to begin with. I think that's an unbelievable shame. You know, I can say that I went through a major university and wasn't really learned towards the importance of the soil life. It should be taught third grade, you know. It's amazing how quickly kids can pick it up too. I walk through the woods with my son maybe every other day, and you know, we find the mushrooms and get him talking about diversity and symbiosis, and you know, it's really amazing to see him pick it up and then tell somebody else, and they're like, what is he talking about? This stuff is really not difficult. It just takes a little bit of familiarity and reverence, really, you know. And really, if you get to the point of understanding that organic growing is feeding microbes, they get important really quick. Not next week, but the week after, we're going to talk about weeds, pests, and disease. A lot of that is born of mineral deficiency. So this is kind of setting the stage, you know, how to be proactive in bringing balance to the soil. We can wait on weeds. They grow to regenerate deficiencies in the soil. We can spray compost teas and wait on the microbes. Most of the time, the patience that we have is exhausted in waiting for these natural mechanisms. Nature moves at a different time scale than humanity. Which is, you know, the point of toxic rescue chemistry and the selective herbicides and the weeds gone tomorrow type immediate gratification. But some proper perspective around this really will not only work better in the long run, but it costs a lot less. You know, organics is more expensive when you don't have a food web in your soil because you're constantly bringing the crutch. And if there's no engine in the soil to make this system work the way that it can and manufacture the plant food that's possible through the food web activity, you're left fertilizing for the rest of your life. So there's nothing wrong with fertilizer. It's the bridge. The goal is to wean ourselves off the requirement for it, depending on the quality of the soil, the exchange capacity, which we'll talk about in a second, and the crops that we're growing. Fertilizer is not something that's negative. It is necessary to meet a yield requirement in a farming enterprise. But most people rely on it without thinking that there's other ways to get the soil working for them. So you can't see quality in soil. I mean, if you're good and get experience, you can get an inclination, mostly I would say through the plant growth. But the quality of the soil really needs to be tested to be analyzed in any kind of analytical way. So here's just some stats, how small soil is. 0.033% of the elements or the minerals presented to a plant actually turn into the plant itself. The rest of it is just there to push it in with a concentration gradient primarily, and most of it is lost. I think 70% of the water solution that we apply to a garden is lost through the root zone. So just to put a size perspective on an element, calcium ion is 15 nanometers. Human hair is 70,000. So it just puts a little scale on it, right? These elements we don't see them. They are conceptual, and we've done a really good job of putting them in the right place and being able to talk to them and talk about them and put them together in really proactive ways based on what we've learned. But it's important to understand, there's people that'll tell you they've seen water molecules, but I haven't seen anything that's very definitive there. So this is not a visual environment. And just, throwing in on microbes, up to 500,000 bacteria can fit in the period at the end of a sentence in a book. I mean, look at a book next to you and try to imagine 500,000 of anything fitting in there, right? So this is, off the scale small. So let's get into some soil chemistry. What you have is energy. The soil, even in the simplest methods of investigation towards soil chemistry, is energetic. One of the things that makes me that is apparent to me as when I talk about energy and life force and these kinds of things, is that it gets pretty far out for people. And this is a really easy point to make. Somebody's familiar with the exchange capacity and the electrical nature of the soil, bingo, right? I mean, the fundamentals of how soil work is energetic. So you have what's called cations and anions. You may remember some of this from chemistry class in school. Cation is positively charged, and the anion is negatively charged, and opposites attract, right? Negative attracts positive, and vice versa. So on paper, soil is sand, clay, and organic matter. Extreme oversimplification, but physically speaking, that's absolutely true. Sand is a neutral substance. It's not positive or negative. It's inert. It's basically there to allow drainage, kind of like perlite in a potting soil would. Whereas clay and organic matter both have a net negative charge. So the soil as an entity is negatively charged. Just to make clear, clay is not very dynamic. It really is just negatively charged. Take it or leave it. There it is. Organic matter actually is more complex, and it has both positive and negative binding sites, which means it can basically hold anything. So what that means in actionable terms is you can have a really clay-based soil with a huge exchange capacity, and we'll talk about that in a second. It can hold a lot, but it can't hold the negatively charged elements because there's no positive orientation to it. So a healthy mixture of those three ends up with this negative charge. And this is, just a little visual along those lines. You've got these soil particles that are charged positively or negatively. And then you have, this is an image of let's say, a clay particle it's negatively charged. It's going to hold positive elements. And, it's just a visualization, but kind of sit with that for a second. The soil can hold on to positively charged elements. And if it's not mature, typically can't hold negatively charged elements, phosphorus, sulfur, etc. There's some micronutrients that are negatively charged. So that phenomenon creates what is called the cation exchange capacity. There is also an anion exchange capacity, but typically, other than in the Antilles, in the islands, soil in the United States, for in general terms, and maybe there's a pocket here and there, is typically looked at it from the nature of a cation exchange capacity. It's on pretty much every soil test I've ever seen. So it's the total capacity to hold the exchangeable positively charged elements, the cations. It adsorbs these elements as opposed to absorb like a sponge. It just holds onto it electrically on the outside, like static cling, something like that. So think of it like a bucket. You can't pour 10 gallons of water in a 5-gallon bucket. There's a capacity to the soil's ability to do that. Or a gas tank. The larger the tank, the more the soil can go on its own without fertilization. If you're above a 7 on exchange capacity by the book, typically, and you balance the elements in the soil, you can grow crops with no fertilizer. If you're in a sandy environment like where I live, where the soil is very immature, very low organic matter, no clay, fertilization is really required. So our goal is to grow the capacity of the soil to hold more so that we can input less. That's one simple way of thinking about it. So this exchange capacity is referenced through a number, and that number represents 100%. And we'll see in a minute how we work with that, but I wanted to show you a couple of just a little bit more detailed diagrams of the exchange capacity. So here we are with our clay particle, and clay is really small, so even smaller than sand and organic matter for that matter. So this is really a visual, but what the plant does is when the clay is holding all the positive elements, the opposites are attracting. When the plant requires a certain element, its root absorbs that element through active transport or whatever mechanism that it's using, and it does a bait and switch. It offers a hydrogen in return. So in general terms, outside of geographical influence, where you might have a lime bed under you or something like that, soil trends to the acidic. pH is defined acidic. The more hydrogen present, the more acidic the soil. So over time, what happens is all the beneficial elements are used. Hydrogen's used to replace it. The soil becomes more acidic. Basically, acidic soil means it's empty. And when we use lime, we fill it up with calcium. But the takeaway there is, like, what if we have a manganese deficiency or even a magnesium deficiency? Sometimes lime, dolomitic has some magnesium. But anytime you use a singular elemental product like potassium sulfate or Epsom salts or gypsum or lime, it's really important to connect the amount that you're using to the deficiency that you have. Otherwise, you can be creating as much imbalance as you are balance and creating as much havoc as you are trying to amend. So I think this will make sense. Let's walk through a couple more slides here. So you got this ability of the plants to access and replace with hydrogen. Our job is to balance the elements that we're adding back. This is another schematic that kind of gets across the difference between a low CEC soil, a sandy soil, versus a clay soil that would really have a really high CEC. So you can see this 25 CEC is capable of holding so much more than the 5 CEC. The bucket's bigger, the gas tank is bigger, right, in the clay soil. Our goal in both, assuming an immature environment, is to increase the organic matter so that we're more able to hold the negatively charged elements as well. So in either situation, typically you're wanting to do the same thing, bring compost, bring organic matter. You don't really want to add clay to a sandy soil on a cost-benefit stance. But typically, as you're using compost teas and microbes and applying compost over the years, and soil is grown through the exudates of plants and the microbes reciprocating and then eating themselves. Humus is the gut of microbes, guts of microbes, if you will. So you can see some of the practical applications down here. Soils in the higher range, they typically have more clay. More of a certain elemental input is required to move the numbers because there's a bigger tank to fill. Makes sense. It has a greater capacity to hold these nutrients, and it generally has a higher water holding capacity. So sand is the opposite. It really needs to be fertilized if it's below a 10, below a 7, I would say. And you might have to fertilize weekly, whereas the gas tank on the 20 exchange capacity is capable of holding enough nutrition to drive production without the input of fertilizer. So that kind of illustrates a little bit of the different postures through different soil types. This is kind of just another visual of the same thing. You see the bait and switch there, right? It's using the calcium in this diagram and replacing it with hydrogen. So as we add back, we want to make sure we're not just doing it through a singular elemental product. I mean, you can use, I'll show you some soil testing in a minute where too much lime was used, but you can add lime and make the pH number perfect every single time. It's an equation. You're this much deficient in calcium per acre, add this amount, and your number is 6.4. But it's moving the number on a piece of paper, right? It's not addressing the soil from a deficiency standpoint. So with that, this video is really well done, I think, and it's a USDA effort, so I'm proud of them for that. But I thought it really got across some of these points in a good way. So check this out.
Not all soils are created equal, and if it weren't for chemistry, we wouldn't be able to grow many crops here, nor here, nor here. It's like this. Soils are composed of sand, silt, clay, and organic matter. Some have more sand, others more clay. Each soil's unique blend determines its color, texture, and storage capacity for nutritious chemicals. Although incredibly small, nutrients still need their space. And by space, we mean the area surrounding the soil's tiny particles. Keep in mind that surface area is not the same as particle size. For example, clay particles are tiny compared to sand, but they have more than 1,000 times as much external surface area as the particles in an equal volume of sand. However, if a nutrient just sits there unattached, it will likely leach out from the soil when it rains and will not be available for plants. Remember that time when you rubbed a balloon on your best friend's hair and stuck it to a wall? Well, a similar phenomenon occurs in the soil. Through their electrostatic energy, nutrients cling on to clay particle surfaces. Nutrients like calcium, magnesium, potassium, and ammonium are all positively charged chemicals, or cations. And as it turns out, most clay particles and organic matter in soil are negatively charged. So, many nutrients are positive and particles are negative. Perfect. In chemistry, as in romance, opposites attract. Good. No more leaching. But like the balloon on the wall, the nutrients are only temporarily held. In fact, there's actually a shell of water molecules that forms around the cation, preventing it from bonding permanently. This shell is often called a hydration sphere, but that's a whole other video. So, back to cations. Basically, if a plant wants a nutritious cation like potassium, it will need to exchange it for another cation or cations of equal charge. Luckily, plants produce hydrogen cations that they can exchange. One hydrogen cation for one potassium cation. Easy enough. But for nutrients with a positive charge of 2, like calcium, 2 hydrogen cations are needed. The higher the positive charge, the harder it gets to exchange or trade cations. That's because a cation with high positive charge and small size is preferentially held by the soil over those with lower charge or larger size, meaning that a large cation with a positive charge of 1 will be the first to be released. A divalent cation having a charge of 2 will be released more easily than a cation with a positive charge of 3. Whether they are held tightly or not, the nutrients are available to the plant in exchange for other cations. Not all nutrients are cations, however. Some are actually negatively charged compounds, or anions. Since anions, like nitrate or sulfate, have a negative charge, they are unable to attach themselves to negatively charged particles and, as a result, leach out when watered. Of course, all soils are different. There are soils in the tropics, for example, that have positively charged soil particles. And in that case, it's the anions, not cations, that are held temporarily and then exchanged with other anions. Most soils, however, have negatively charged particles. The more negatively charged a soil is and the more surface area a soil has, the more cation exchange capacity it has. This is such an important factor for plant growth that scientists measure a soil's cation exchange capacity, CEC, in order to help farmers determine how much and how often fertilization is needed. That's because CEC is sort of like a cup size at a fast food joint. Some soils are supersized, but others have a kiddie cup. Pouring too much will just cause a mess, but if you refill several times, you can still quench your thirst. Farming in low CEC soils works almost the same way. Even though the soil has lower capacity, you can fertilize more often using smaller amounts, and the plants will grow healthy and strong. And it's a good thing too. Otherwise, we'd have very little land to farm. So the fact that farmers can grow crops almost anywhere kind of seems like superhero powers. But really, it's just knowing about chemistry.
So that's a pretty good primer there. I didn't know until I found this video. I can't remember where I found it, but that the tropics had different soil types. It's kind of fascinating to think about. Like to see their soil agronomist situation. It's, you know, as complicated as this stuff can be, but the takeaway is pretty clear. The soil holds cations, also holds anions through the organic matter, which they didn't reference. But it's important to understand that soil has this capacity, and our job is to balance the elements within that. And this information is fairly well known. There's a sweet spot in the soil that I want to talk about here for a minute. So Dr. William Albrecht is really the pioneer of this approach. And in the 20s through the 40s at the University of Missouri, him and his team just did unbelievable amounts of rigorous testing in crop growth in regards to different deliberately balanced soils. So, you know, when you see, you know, the university, the numbers that they came up there right below the University of Missouri Ag Station bullet, generally speaking, you're 65% calcium, 15% magnesium, 4% potassium, 3% sodium, and the rest in micronutrients, with a slight exchangeable hydrogen, because you want your soil to be slightly acidic, let's say 6.4, 6.5. All of this is a range. You can take a soil test from the same general vicinity and get two slightly different results from the lab. It's not an exact science. So for example, you know, you might change your analysis and recommendation based on the soil type. You know, when you have a high magnesium soil and a low calcium, the pH can be 6.4, right where you want it to be, because basically you've got the same amount of exchangeable hydrogen in the exchange capacity, but the balance of the elements is off. And so when that happens, you have cracking soil, you know, you have really tight soil that won't receive water very well, and typically in a clay soil. So, you know, when you see that, you can try to till it up all you want, but it's just going to come right back into the scenario that you experienced previously. The problem is the calcium magnesium ratio is off. So in those types of soils, you might shoot for 70% calcium, 10% magnesium. And there's any number of metrics beyond that, and I'll show you a little bit of what we do in a minute. But we do all of this analysis through what we call fertility management services. I'm going to give you some information on how you can take advantage of that in a minute. But it can be really complex, and our goal is to try to make that simple. So just kind of finish up some of the vernacular here. Look into Dr. Albrecht's work. You know, we're standing on the backs of giants, and we've added our own anecdotes, you know, through our experience and over the years. But he really wrote the book on this stuff, and it's all out there for the taking. So I wanted to talk about base saturation just to make sure that's understood. Base saturation is the percentage of the exchange capacity that a particular cation occupies. So when we talk about 65% calcium in the exchange capacity, 65% base saturation of calcium is what we're referring to. Of the 100%, how much of it do we want to be calcium? And the cool thing is, Albrecht told us the general range of what we're looking for. All we really do is take, you know, an inventory of what's in the soil with the soil test, run it through a spreadsheet that tells us the deficiency by weight per area. And we do the math on using how much, you know, if you're deficient in calcium and not magnesium, you don't want to use dolomitic lime because you're adding more magnesium with that, right? You want a high calcium lime. So we can actually tell you, you know, if you're 36 pounds deficient in calcium per 1,000 square feet and lime is 36% calcium, well, then you need 100 pounds of lime, right? So when we address from the elemental deficiency, that's the irony of the pH-driven approach that kind of dominates conventional agriculture, is that when you get the balance right, the pH is always perfect. It's the afterthought. You end up at a 6.4, 6.5 pH when you've got that 65% calcium, you know, 15 magnesium, 7 potassium, 4 sodium, etc. General range. So basically, pH is not a really good way of looking at soil health. It is a metric that can tell you hit your mark, but it's not something that should drive your action. So just to make sure pH is understood, it's basically a range from 1 to 14, 7 being neutral. It expresses acidity or alkalinity. Acidity is on the lower number side and alkalinity is above 7. It's an algorithm of hydrogen ion presence. The more hydrogen present, the more acidic. The more caustic it gets, the more acidic it gets because of the free hydrogen. So, we want it to be slightly acidic, the soil. That's kind of a life spot, if you will. And I want to show you, this is pretty interesting. This is a little schematic of some different materials that we might be familiar with in their pH. And this kind of diagram really kind of gets you thinking about pH as like a state of existence, like battery acid or something like that. What it really is doing is measuring how many hydrogen ions are present. So when we're talking about soil, we can remove the hydrogen's got the weakest bond. It's the smallest molecule in the soil, and it's the weakest bond. So basically, any positively charged element that we put into the soil is going to replace that hydrogen, and it's going to off gas, right? So our job is to just fill the soil up and balance. And when we do that, our pH is right where we want it to be. Hopefully that hits home. But check this out. So we've got a perfect pH if we balance the soil. This is a diagram that's typically used in the hydroponic realm of things. And the thickness of the line represents how available the element is. We looked at this when we talked about hydro a little bit last week. So you see the sweet spot here is right in the yellow range, right? 6, 6.5, somewhere in there. It's when all elements are most available. It's very fascinating to me that the balance of the elements held by the soil end up with a 6.5, 6 pH. And then the place in which they're most available is that same region. That's where the truth's found, right? When you've got truths from different sides of the story meeting in the middle. And that's, it didn't really occur to me directly until a couple of months ago that was the way this worked. But I work in the hydroponic realm. Think of hydroponics like an instant exchange capacity, right? Instead of the water being able to hold things like an exchange capacity in the soil does electrically, water is just an open book. So the fertilizer that we're adding in a soluble form is engineered by the manufacturer to have this relative balance that we're looking for. So we don't really think about it, right? We take it for granted. Which is the point. We can just add the concentration of fertilizer that we want for the crop that we're growing, and take advantage of the fact that the balance that we're bringing has already been engineered. Soil's a bit of a different animal. We really have to kind of take an inventory of what's there to know what to add. So think about people that add Epsom salts to the tomatoes every year. It's not anything innately wrong with doing that. It's not toxic or anything like that, right? But what you're doing is adding magnesium sulfate only, and perpetually year after year. Same thing happens when people add lime to sweeten their soil, because the pH is low every year. You're building up a singular element at the expense of all of the other ones. So you can kind of get yourself in trouble and think you're doing the right thing, right? But you're still dealing with pests and weeds and disease and what's going on. My pH is perfect. I don't know what else to do. And you just go out there and resort to killing everything, which is probably what everybody does without this level of articulation. So anyway, really interesting on pH. It's not something that should affect how we do things, but there is some insight drawn to seeking the balance that brings you to this sweet spot, and then the availability of those elements solubly at that sweet spot. That's really very interesting. May have seen this before. There's not a whole lot of analytical data that comes out of Mulder's chart, but this is kind of an accumulation of insights and soil chemistry over the years, and it can kind of give you an idea of synergy and antagonism between elements. A lot of the work that we do is ratio based. You want 1/1000th of boron to make calcium available. A lot of glossinarenolide is actually caused by boron deficiencies. People are throwing calcium at it because the label of the calcium product has a juicy red tomato on it, and it's kind of by the book, but they're adding more of what they might already have too much of, and they're not even thinking about boron. That happens all the time in my area. We typically have high calcium or adequate calcium in our soil. I wouldn't say high because it's very acidic, sandy soil. But people are throwing had blossom end rot, throwing all kinds of calcium at it. Come to find out through a soil test that they've got all the calcium that they need, and they're off the charts deficient in boron. So, the idea is not to figure all of this out, but to take a step back, a deep breath, and ask ourselves what the ecosystem wants, not what we want to get out of it, not what the number on the piece of paper is telling us, if you will. So, you can look into Mulder's chart and get some value out of it, but for me, it's mostly just a visual to understand that elements play off of each other, right? You got the number of different elements we're looking at, the form of the element that it's in, which you get a greater diversity of the different isotopes and forms of elements through organic materials than you would through salt-based artificial materials. And then it's the ratio of the elements to each other. And if we keep, most of the time we don't get past the number of elements if we even ask that question. The majority of backyard growers in the United States use something like Miracle-Gro, and it's got 7 elements in it. Plant has to have 14 through the soil to grow, or in a hydroponic nutrient. So, we're feeding the garden fast food, and then, we shouldn't be surprised at the issues that rear their head. So Mulder's chart is a resource. I just took a screenshot of a spreadsheet that I use as a primer, and it kind of give you an idea of what we're looking at. You can see the 1/1000th of boron to calcium here is something that we're looking at. You want, potash equal to phosphate by weight. Some labs cycle this as P, or some others do it as phosphate. So, it's the same thing on an NPK. You really have to look beyond the number that you're presented with to understand what it actually is. But, you can see, the different ratios of things that we're looking in zinc. You want 50% of copper. Are you going to get all of this exact every time? No. But does it give you the level of knowledge that you need not to be adding more copper when you've got a deficiency in zinc, for example? Absolutely. And you can see, the way we differentiate what kind of magnesium we want based on the soil type. This is the base saturation that we're looking for with the slight acidity with the exchangeable hydrogen. And then, manganese, you want 50% of that of iron, and, so on. So you can see this can get, really complicated pretty quick, especially when you entertain the variables of the different soil types. So, with that, again, my goal here is not to make you a soil testing expert, but just to kind of plant the seed that there's more going on than just a set of numbers on a piece of paper. And there is ways to articulate this that can create really dramatic results. So I wanted to give you a couple of data sets, and don't be overwhelmed by this. Question real quick, Josiah, can you see my cursor when I'm moving around like that?
Yeah, we sure can.
Okay, great.
And if you want to make it more defined, you can using the annotation button on top.
Where's that? Annotation. Oh, okay. Oh, wow. Oh, watch out. I can draw.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's check that out. All right, cool. So basically, let's look at the soil test. You've got, so this is a client that in Wilmington that we had in our lawn care days. And I include this one to show you the difference between a yard versus the beds that she had created. I don't have it's years ago, I don't have the exact detail, but it's safe to say that when she created the beds, she brought in soil that was of a much higher organic capacity and organic matter capacity than the native soil. So her lawn is the native soil. Her beds were built up by bringing in soil. Notice how drastically different the number sets are. You can see the organic matter percentage is 10. That's really high. Typically, we don't see above 2. And if you're not above 4%, you really are, need to focus on adding the organic matter. You can move the organic matter about a point. For every, I think it's, what is it? For every 10 inches, you get, well, I'll step back from that one. I can't remember the exactness, and I don't want to say it wrong. But the bottom line is adding compost, starting a compost pile at your house, bringing in the cheap compost that you can find around you that's probably just high-end mulch, aged manure. And using compost teas on that to break it down and get the system working, mulch mowing in your lawns, chop and drop, all of these things are going to build the organic matter capacity in the soil. In her beds here, she doesn't need to do any of that. You typically see like a 20-25 in a potting soil, for example, because they got a lot of peat moss that has a high exchange capacity in it. So you can also see the exchange capacity here is 3 times what it is in the yard. Notice the pH is different. She hadn't done a whole lot of proactive work here. This is just basically what she had when we started working with her. So you can see if she's treating her beds in her yard in the same way, which, you know, admittedly not most people don't, she's creating as much issue as she is helping. For example, she wants to add lime to her yard. It's 25% calcium. She needs at least 60, right? So you can see with that level of deficient in calcium, she's going to end up with an acidic pH, which is woefully low. That basically means the soil's tremendously empty. She's deficient in almost every category except for potassium here and sodium. But you can see, you know, it's not even a measurable amount of boron. That's pretty typical for native soil here. The iron's low. The manganese is almost off the charts low. Copper is below the range. Zinc is below range. Aluminum's there more for toxicity. Generally, you're not adding aluminum from a nutritional standpoint, but the lab just registers that because if it's above 2,000, it can become toxic. So the takeaway here is that, you know, all soil in a landscape is not the same. And if you're going to do a soil test, you don't want to mix the beds with the lawn with the veggie garden. But you do want to mix the front yard and the backyard. You basically want to approach it where you're taking the sample of the areas you're going to treat similarly. That's about as simple as I can make it. And it's not to say you have to test every environment. I mean, a lot of people can have really good results in a raised bed. I tend to talk people out of it unless they just want the information in smaller gardens, because you can get a good bag of organic fertilizer and some compost tea and jam on your garden and get great results. But doing that, you know, and buying good fertilizer for your lawn that's not 3-element weed and feed, it can be a lot more expensive. And it's just grass, right? We can't eat it. So typically on larger areas, it's highly cost effective to take a soil test. And then the reaction to that is going to be things like lime and gypsum and you know, manganese sulfate and copper sulfate, iron sulfate, things like that, that are relatively inexpensive because they're not labeled branded products. They're commodities. So that's one reason to do it in that way. So point here being that, you know, that all soil is not the same. This is just a quick visual of some clients and just to give you an idea how bad the soil is in our area. I don't know if I've shared this with this group or not, but you know, we took this to this in 8 months with our compost tea and our soil testing. So you can create really dramatic results in a short period of time just by introducing the balance that we're discussing here in general terms. Here's another example. This is a ball field at a local school, and you can see the soil we grew, you know, with your eyes. It's darker down there, right? I mean, you started with that. 8 months later, we got that. So, you know, this is not just like a cool exercise. This is really a way of regenerating land, of making soil instead of dirt, etc. So check this out. This is a client that we connected with who had another lawn care service that was doing soil testing. And what they were doing was managing the pH, and they were doing a really good job with it, right? You can see, you know, this 6.5 here is, you know, where you want to be, right? So the organic matter is typically low, not surprising. This is a lawn, by the way. The exchange capacity is fairly low, right at the range at which we could expect the landscape to take care of itself with proper diversity and microbial relevance. But notice how deficient the magnesium, the potassium, the sodium, and the micronutrients are relative to the calcium. So what I was saying earlier, hopefully that hits home. What this client had done is just added lime based on the pH. And they got the pH that they were looking for, but they've got way more calcium than they need, and they weren't adding anything else. So hopefully that hits home. That's really the misnomer of conventional soil testing, is if you don't look at all of the elements to begin with, how do you know what to add, right? And if you don't have some kind of baseline to apply these singular elemental products, we create tremendous imbalance through our agronomy. So, you know, that's a perfect example of someone doing the right thing and doing what they're told, really, by the experts, if you will. They had hired a lawn care company to give them advice. The lawn care company was trained by the extension service in continuing education. Unlike the doctor that goes to 4 years of school to learn how to do all of these things and apply the right pharmaceuticals and all of these things. It's what they know, right? Not a judgment. That's a perfect example of how you can find yourself in a place you don't really want to be by following conventional wisdom. So I wanted to give you the testimony of this pasture grower. I met this guy just in a forum on Facebook, I believe, and he was asking people for some advice because he was using a compost tea product. It's a perfect example of a guy doing the right thing. He's got 4 acres, and he was buying a compost tea product from this company in Texas that was shipping him a 250-gallon tote of brewed tea. And then he was using it over time and wasn't told that the tea wasn't alive 24 to 36 hours later after it was brewed. So he wasn't harming anything. I mean, he was adding good micronutrients and good plant food because that's what microbes make in a tea brew. So he was getting some level of benefit out of it, but it wasn't getting him the result that he expected, and it really shouldn't have. So when we connected, it was mostly about that. And then we got into the soil testing conversation, and he was looking at things the right way, but we was working with the extension. I think it was Texas A&M, and was given the pH mantra. And so he had it somewhere in his gut. He was like, look, there's got to be more to this. Was reaching out. We connected, and January of last year, I believe. And so he got a brewer, microbe maker. He started applying 20 gallons of the living tea per acre on a bi-weekly basis through his growing season. And he went from, in Texas, he taught me these averages. The average is about 800 pounds. A cow unit is 800 pounds per 5 acres. It's a way for them to talk about it in case they've got some, calves and they've got mature steers or whatever it is they have. It's a way of doing it through weight. So he's getting 28,500 pounds on 4 acres compared to 800 pounds on 5 acres, which I didn't believe the first time he told me that. This was about October of last year, where he gave us his testimony after about, what is that, maybe 10 months of applying these principles. So this is what we did with him. This is where he started. You can see he's got a proper pH. Look at his magnesium there, right? You got, this is really high relative to what you want here, right? So also notice that his pH is right where he wants it to be, right? So in his mind, in his conversation with the people that he's dealing with locally, he's right where he wants to be, but his balance is way out of whack. His potassium's right, his sodium's a little high, but he's got real deficiencies in boron, lower end in iron, real low in zinc, low in manganese, and then low in all his micronutrients, basically, right? So, this guy should not have been getting the result that he wanted, even though he was following the advice of the conventional wisdom from the experts, if you will. So what we did is say, I walked him through these exercises and said, look, we take a different philosophy. It's a balanced approach, deficiency approach. And we worked up some soil testing for him. So with this data, we then ran it through our spreadsheets. It came out with an elemental deficiency, and per acre, this is what we recommended he add. And you can see the gypsum's calcium sulfate. That's gonna, he didn't want to increase his pH, which calcium carbonate will do. Gypsum has the sulfur, the negative sulfur ion with it, calcium sulfate. So it adds calcium without increasing the pH because the negative sulfur binds with the excess of what we're not adding and takes it out of commission, out of solubility. So, he's addressing, if he had a 5.5 pH and a similar scenario, which would be impossible, but just to create an example, we would want to use a high calcium line. Or maybe a dolomitic if he's deficient in magnesium as well, because we wanted to increase the pH. So you can see there's a choice involved in this. It's not just a rough, exact, well, I shouldn't say rough and exact equation in any way, shape, or form. And you can see all the micronutrients, every single one of them he was deficient in, and we gave him a relative amount. I didn't have the data in my file when I put this together of what he actually applied because he sourced the gypsum locally. And he didn't add all the calphos, and I think he went halves on the rest. Maybe he may have picked some that were full. I can't remember, but the point will come across it either way. This side on the left on January 27, 2016 is what we just looked at 2 slides ago. So 9 months, however many months later that is, 10 months later, you can see his pH is still where he wants it to be, right? That was because he added gypsum, not high calcium lime. And look what happened. Again, I don't think he added it to the math that we did. But the point is that I want to get across is everything moved in the right direction. We didn't add any magnesium, no Epsom salts, no dolomitic lime, nothing like that. So that number went down because we didn't add any, right? What we added was gypsum, so it increased the calcium. It increased the sulfur. The calphos was added at a really low amount, but the numbers moved in the right direction. It's also a slow release. 3% of calphos is soluble. The rest, 27% phosphorus total, takes 3 years for it to come out. So, you have to make some assumptions there, right? If you don't see the numbers move right away, you don't want to just keep adding more. You have to take an articulation of the materials that you're using. We didn't add relatively any potassium. The sodium went down. We didn't add any sea minerals, which we typically use for sodium. The boron bumped, the iron bumped, the manganese bumped, the copper bumped, the zinc went way up into range. So you can see everything moved in the right direction. And that came from taking a snapshot of where he was, making recommendations based on his deficiencies, applying them, letting the system come through at least 6 months, and then taking another snapshot. And he's since taken another one, and it was after, I think, right around this data set where he was starting to get the unbelievable results and the testimony that he provided. So, you can see there is a way of thinking our way through this that is highly effective. So this was his testimony that he sent to me. Using your compost tea, fertilizer, and soil testing prescription process, the results are increasing exponentially. I'm carrying 7 cal units per acre as opposed to traditional 1/5 of a cal unit per acre. Total of 28,500 pounds of beef on 4 acres compared to 800 pounds on 5 acres. These have greatly improved with your products. I would say your products have increased production of grass and therefore beef. I'll see in the next year how we do. Hopefully we can increase to about 35,000 pounds per 4 acres. I'll be doing another soil test. So we do this through what's called Fertility Management Services. You can find information on our website. I would also add that, if you go to tv.permaethos.com and find your way towards our channel and support us for $29 for the year, you can ask me questions on this all day if you want, and I live for that. So just to, shameless promotion, please go and support the channel, if you will, on the $29 a year. And if you have questions, I'm sure Josiah can help you, or I can help you. You can contact us through this website if you want. And with that, I wanted to end to kind of set up next week. We've got, the concept of essential, right? What I've been talking about here are what's called the essential elements, which is let's put it this way, what the lab can test for, right? I'm going through a lot of rigmarole on this end, trying to find a lab that can test silica, but there's not a lot of good data about what range it should be in. And generally labs don't offer it, but I consider it an essential element. It's woefully deficient in soils. And what's there in the sand component is not available for nutrition to plants. So, it's fair game to say, well, look, if we manage the essential elements, we can increase the efficiency of our agronomy, the yields, lessen all the target issues that we deal with, etc. But what I want to say is that there's a lot more going on than just what we test for and what we can figure out. You can see our fertility management services test for 12 elements out of the box. We can seek some more if the person's interested, but our base programs test for 12. That's typically the amount that you'll see in a hydroponic fertilizer, which basically is the whole concept of essential elements, right? It's like what the plant has to have. Compared to Miracle-Gro, it's got like 5 to 7 elements in it. So, we're making progress in that conversation, but there's over 90 earthbound elements. That's really the justification for the product Earth Tonic that we make is, why would Mother Nature make an element not needed in the soil? And it's a rhetorical question. She wouldn't. And our ability to figure out how each element works, either directly to the plant or indirectly through the enzymatic potential of or through some other mechanism that we haven't even thought about yet, there's a large potential to be deficient in trace elements. And this is really kind of a mantra of mine. It gets the point across. If it's not in the soil, it's not in the plant. It's not in the plant. It's not in the people. I'm completely convinced that modern, disease in basically all forms is rooted in malnourishment, trace element of malnourishment in people. And there's a lot of good anecdotes. We haven't been studying it very long the way we have, conventional medicine, but I think you'll see progressively that more information comes out about this. And so I just wanted to reference the idea that, what we just talked about was the essential conversation. What we want to imagine is that there's more going on than we can measure, and we don't want to assume that it's not relevant. So, next week what we'll talk about is like total and complete nutrition is how I'm kind of talking about it. But it involves sea energy agriculture, trace elements, things like that. And here's some conclusions. How do we know what to add if we don't know what's missing? And that's just a rehash of the mantra there. Healthy people need healthy food, grown from plants and healthy soil. Somewhat obvious. And here's some progression, something to think about, and reasons to tune in the coming weeks. We're going to do the total complete nutrition next week, and I'm going to flesh this out a little bit in a different angle with the weeds, pest, and disease talk, and then we'll get into some of the soil food web stuff with microbes and jam out on that for a while. And with that, appreciate your attention, and if there's any questions, happy to take them.
All right. That was awesome, man. I got to find some grass-fed beef forms and start sending them this video.
Yeah. This is
that was quite the testimonial.
Yeah, I honestly called them. I was like, "Is this real?" And I'm almost reticent to share it, but this guy's a traveling nurse, and he does this as a side business, and he's killing it, man. It's really amazing.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So the question I got here is, what is ppm?
Interesting. Was that from the soil testing document? Yeah, it's parts per million.
Yeah.
Oh, and it basically is parts of ions per million of water. It's not elementally relevant in any way. It's just a measurement of the total number of ions that can be detected by the lab, if you will.
And we got the same question during the hydroponics versus organics show.
Mm-hmm.
All right, guys. Like Evan was saying, I will push it down your throat. $29 a year. I mean, that's a pretty good value. It's every week this kind of information is coming out. And so support the show. Head over there, $29 a year at tv.permethos.com. And you can see previous episodes. What we're going to start doing here is only showing the last 3 episodes. And for you to freely view, as well as on podcasts, you only get the last 3. And so if you're a $29 a year subscriber and supporting the show, you get access to all of them, and you can ask any questions you want on any of the episodes, and Evan will answer them. So that's pretty awesome. Thanks, Evan.
Yeah, no doubt. Bring it, guys.
That's a huge value, I think. The kind of information you're sharing is far more valuable than $29 a year. But
for sure.
Yeah. All right. We can take your questions. If you have any questions, hit the Q&A button. Otherwise, we're going to wrap up for the day. Yeah, I almost feel like maybe the live Q&A stuff we'll stop doing in the future because we get more questions because more people rewatch it.
Yeah.
Or we bring up those questions from previous shows after each live one, but I think it might be better to do separate Q&A sessions.
Yeah, it takes a minute for it to sink in sometimes too. It can sound like a different language.
Yeah, with this kind of stuff, I think a lot of people are replaying a lot of this, and because it's a lot of information to sink in.
Yeah, and I just invite people, if you've done soil testing, one of the things you can do by supporting the show is just send it to me, right? And what we'll get out of it is 9 times out of 10, they're not looking for all of the elements in North Carolina, they look for 7 elements on the soil testing. So it's really, even if we can't nail down any kind of analytic or reaction completely, what we can learn is kind of the limitations of it. And what I find in going through that exercise is it really starts to justify going out and doing some soil testing from the lab that we use. And we use the lab that we do, not because they're better at taking the lab work, but just because we've built the process around how they do the assay. So, this soil testing, you can get a basic soil test for like $60 with reaction. The full program that we do with survey and recommendations is about $300. But so depending on your operation, we can work with you in a lot of different ways. But just start by sending me what you got, and we can draw some kind of conclusion from it and go from there.
All right. Some quick things. Susan says, "What the heck? I just found this part. Where can I ask questions?" Um, you were in the right place to ask him. Oh, where I can ask questions. Yep. You can still ask your question if you want, Susan. We're going to be on for a couple more minutes. Melanie says, where do we find the recording of this episode? I had the wrong time zone and joined late. Yeah, Melanie, the tv.permeethos.com, you'll find the latest 3 episodes there where you can watch them as many times as you want. And Ben asks, what situations might warrant heavy subsoiler tillage? How would this affect soil nutrient capacity? I'm looking at a food forest site chosen by our food council that has a 12-inch clay pan on top of 12 inches of sand layer, probably due to prior construction. Is this one of those tillage situations, or could chicken tractors do enough?
Without knowing more tillage to begin with, you know, you kind of have to take every situation differently, but the subsoil has its own ability to exchange. So what happens a lot is you have magnesium fall in the soil. So the subsoil, like that bottom 12 inches that you were talking about below the clay, might be accumulating, and I'm just creating an example because we'd have to do the testing, but might be accumulating magnesium. And that's, if you remember what we were talking about, the magnesium high, calcium low creates a real tightness in the soil. So it basically creates a barrier that the plant root can't penetrate. And you're not getting the benefit of what's down there, which is highly beneficial. Incidentally, this is a lot of the reasons that really aggressive weeds grow. The more aggressive your weed spectrum, the more deficiencies you have, right? Because the weed is growing, and it's more direct than you might imagine. Take a dandelion, it grows to regenerate calcium, and its taproot, if you ever tried to pull one up, is all the way down in the middle of the earth. And what it's doing is going down into the subsoil, fixing the elements that are deficient in the topsoil, and then dying seasonally to regenerate what's there. And it's a slow process. So what you get, you can actually do 2 different tests of the subsoil. It's quite a bit of effort. You know, it sounds like you've already done it if you know the geography you're working with there. But, you know, once you get down there and you can take samples of the subsoil, you can glean that type of information. And then if we see a high magnesium, for example, we can, you know, make deliberate applications that account for that and open up that subsoil. And all of a sudden, the crops that you do want to grow on the surface can penetrate a whole nother foot down in the ground and have that much more access. So you're thinking about it is right. You know, you don't know until you test. You can't look at it and tell. And so generally speaking, especially at the beginning of a project, there's nothing innately wrong with tilling. I mean, you know, the no-till approach is admirable and of potential, but it's kind of like, you know, break it up to start with, and then let's apply the proper agronomy so that we can, you know, maintain the tilth that we've created through the physicality that we've entertained. So that's a good question. It sounds like you're thinking about it right. And, you know, part of what we do through our FMS services is do a survey that really gets us intimate with what we can learn remotely about your area and your problems and your goals. And then, you know, with the data that we generate, you write a real nice report that kind of hits the high notes and gets moving in the right direction.
And he's got follow-ups for you. He says, I'm just being asked to come in and help now, so he had no input on the site choice. But he's asking, what might we add before tillage to incorporate beyond just organic matter?
Well, if you've got clay on the top, sand on the bottom, what that's telling me is that you're not seeing organic matter. So, you know, if you recall when we were talking, really either soil type, you want the same thing, because your clay has a high exchange capacity. It can hold a lot, but it's only going to hold the positive elements. It's not going to hold any of the negative ones. So you probably got a pretty extreme phosphorus deficiency without doing the testing. So one of the tests that we do through the FMS services is a physical test. We get a percentage base of the sand, clay, and organic matter present. And that gives us, you know, without having to rely on our eyes, which we talked about is really difficult, it gives us a soil type. We also do some remote geographical research that shows us the soil type that should be in your area, not influenced by construction, things like that. So, you know, unfortunately, without doing the testing, it's really hard to say what you should do. But if you're seeing clay and then you're seeing sand, the tillage wouldn't be a bad idea. And you might think about, you know, if you can find a higher quality compost as opposed to something like wood chips, it's going to get you to where you want to go quicker. But you can apply any type of organic matter to that environment and then just hit it with compost teas weekly to monthly to make sure that the microbes are there that can break it down and put it into what it wants. And you're going to be moving in the right direction. And then from there, that's really the name of the game. You know, when we do the soil testing, if you've got adequate calcium and you need magnesium, well, then we know what to move forward with and what not to. But without that analytic, it's really kind of a difficult judgment call there. You know?
And with him wanting to do like run chickens over it to help, is there any issue with mixing the compost tea and chickens right after each other or with each other?
No, that's a great question. A lot of people use our compost tea in chicken coops for odor issues, and it pre-composts it. You know, all the odor is an anaerobic decomposition because the chicken's applying basically gut microbes with the manure. And if the soil in the litter is not alive, which it wouldn't be unless you consciously added soil microbes, you get a lot of these odors on the decomposition process, kind of like driving by a marsh on low tide. You know, you get the odors from the anaerobic condition. So, you know, proactively adding these aerobic microbes not only retains a lot of the nitrogen that gets off-gassed through the stabilization process of the anaerobic decomposition, but it tamps down the odors and makes the chicken manure more available. So anytime you can get animals on the land, they're going to do what they do in a positive way. All you're doing with the tea is ensuring that, you know, I put it this way, it's not conducive to imagining your soil is what you think it is unless you make it that way. And that really is kind of like what you're describing. And, you know, you've got probably construction that created a soil horizon environment that's completely unnatural, and there's nothing natural there that can put it back in its place. And that's really the exercise is let's check the box with assurance rather than assuming the microbes are there, and the result that we get out of it, we can check that box off of our troubleshooting going forward.
And do you think, so would it be better to either put the compost tea down before, like if you're running chicken tractors, would you put a compost tea down before the tractor went over that area or right after?
It's a good question. Either or. There's not a sequence kind of scenario. You could argue that there would be a greater potential of influence by spraying the actual litter because the litter is more potential than the soil. In other words, like if you're applying tea, this will kind of make the point. If you're applying tea on a virgin property that just is, you know, chemically altered or deficient, the microbes that you're applying in that difficult environment are like the front lines in a war. A lot of them are dying, and they're generating what they can, but the consistency of your application is going to be a lot more important compared to like a nice fresh compost pile that you just created. All of that material that you put to compost is potential, right? It's not like empty sandy soil that's chemically treated, for example. So in a composting application, really you only need to apply the soil microbes one time. And then as long as you don't start over in some new scenario or clean it out, you don't have to add them back because there's so much potential there. They're just jamming, you know? So, you know, in that, kind of get more technical than the generality, if you had the litter there to spray down afterwards, I think the same way about like mulch mowing in my lawn. I don't, you know, I can spray the tea before I do the mulch mow, but it makes me feel better to spray down the clippings that I just created, for example. But I wouldn't say that it's necessarily wrong either way. People ask the same thing about, you know, if it's going to rain later today, which is big in the realm of fertilization. You don't want the fertilizer to just, you know, run off that you just applied, which is the way you should be approaching it. But microbes hold on really tight. You know, I mean, when you brush your teeth, you're brushing microbes off and you don't get them all, you know. So the idea that the rain is going to wash them away is really a fertilizer mindset. As long as you don't have standing water, it's totally conducive to apply it basically whenever you want, outside of the middle of the day. There is some relevance not to apply it in the top of the day so the sun doesn't scorch them.
Yeah, and you're not just leaving behind salt.
Right. Yeah. Right.
So a lot of people get their compost from these like dairy lots or cattle holds,
Mm-hmm.
and so the farmer has all this poop and they make compost out of it, but it's arguable that that's not the best compost that you could get. Would it be financially viable or even work better to add compost tea to those kind of compost tiles?
Yeah, that's a great question. In general terms, the compost tea is concentrating compost in the same way that compost concentrates soil. I mean, let's be clear, in the forest when the leaves fall and the soil microbes turn that into plant food, that is composting. Same process. It's just happening on a bit of a slower scale because it's passive. When you put the compost together, you're turning it once a week. You're idealizing the ratios. Your intention is to use it, if it is, or just to divert organic waste. You're concentrating the process. So compost tea concentrates compost and grows a concentration of microbes that isn't possible in nature because you've idealized the situation, which is really what justifies it. You can spray the compost as through a cost-effective liquid rather than haul the organic matter that took you 2 months to make. So in that respect, compost tea is always a more efficient way of adding soil microbes, but it's not going to increase the organic matter percentage on the soil test, for example, the way compost would. So what I would do is answer your question by saying there's nothing negative about buying that cheap compost. As a matter of fact, I would encourage you, as long as you're comfortable with the toxicity level of it, which is a fair question and really difficult to get transparency from. But assuming that, it's relatively clean situation, you're right. 99%, I would say, based on my observation and experience engaging composting operations, is aged manure. It's made by gut microbes, right? So to your point, the manure, even though the farmer is telling you they're making compost out of it, if you ask them, and this is kind of the litmus test, is just ask that person selling you the compost, what kind of soil microbes do you guys use to make the compost? Or do you have any biological testing? And 9 times out of 10, if not more, they're going to say, what did you say? They're not even thinking about what a microbe is, right? And that I could speak directly from around me. It's all turkey manure and pine bark. And I ask these guys, just because I get a kick out of it at this point, do you have biological testing? And they don't have it. They don't even know what that is. And I did the biological testing, and there's not a soil microbe in it, right? There's, matter of fact, there's lesionous nematodes and urea, and it shows a really immature state of the organic matter. It's mulch. It's not humus. It's mulch with, soluble fertilizer from the urea and the manure. But once that urea and manure fertilizer runs out, there's no soil microbes in there to make that manure physically into humus. The process, it doesn't just melt, right? It's biologically decomposed by diverse microbes. So yes, to answer your question, get the cheap compost. Nothing wrong with that, but don't make the assumption that it's actually humus, right? And that's where the compost tea comes in. It's buy the cheap stuff, spray a gallon of compost tea per 500 square feet once you've applied it. And what we used to do is buy the cheap stuff. We actually use these respiration tests. They're called a Solvita test. You can get them from Woods End in Massachusetts. And it's a respiration test for microbes. And it's like a litmus test from 1 to 10. And it gives you a relative measurement of the maturity of the compost. And what we would buy is like a 2. And you want it at least a 7 to use it from their perspective. So it's really immature. And we spray it down with the tea. We give it a good turn, maybe once a week, and stage it for a month to 2 months until it was finished. And then what we found when we used it is the difference in how it worked is just night and day. It's the most frustrating thing in the world to buy the right thing as compost and have it not work, or have it work decent the first year. Next year, everything's falling apart. There's no engine in the soil microbe diversity to do anything for it. That's where the fertilizer comes from.
And do you worry about antibiotics in cattle manure?
Yes and no. I mean, there's very little that you can do about it if it's not certified organic. I would make the point that, especially if you're going to be aggressive with soil microbes, their job is to mitigate toxicity. So it's kind of like asking, should I brew compost tea if I have chlorine in my city water? Well, yeah, admittedly, this chlorine is not going to help those microbes at all. That's why they put the chlorine in the water system, to keep the microbes away. But the concentration of microbes that you're growing in a tea is way beyond what that toxicity can eliminate. So it's a better best analysis. There's really never a scenario where you wouldn't want to use microbes. And if you're dealing with those antibiotics, yeah, they're there to prevent that biological scenario. But relative to the concentration that you're bringing, I wouldn't say it would defeat the purpose in any way.
All right. Let's see here. Next question is from Jamie. Jamie says, is there a magic seed mix of cover crops or weeds that will generally improve most poor soils quickly, like in a couple of seasons?
Yeah, there are. The best expert that I know on that is Simple Soil Solutions, Vale Dixon. She's my go-to for cover crops, and she's actually putting on, I don't know if it's today or it's real soon. If it's not today, a course. And even if you just shot her an email, tell her I sent you, she'll take care of you. And I kind of defer to her on the actual mixes that you want. But there's a lot of specificity you can get. Her specialty is to get the system to work on its own without bringing in inputs, and she still uses them. And there's a lot of value in that. I find that the catalyzation of the result comes a lot quicker when you marry all of these things intentionally. But it's a good question. I just don't have a really specific answer for you.
All right. Next question. How do you deal with an unturnable compost pile? Is there a way to continue a compost going that you're adding materials to, but are not able to turn the pile?
Yeah, I'm assuming that it's just physical. You can't take the pitchfork to it. Maybe it's too big, or is it physically unturnable?
It's one of those copper pipes
Okay.
to heat water.
Yep. The first thing I would say is that you don't have to turn compost. That, in the large majority of cases, it will speed the process up, don't get me wrong. But actually the best compost is not turned. And the reason is you're challenging the microbe to go back from, anaerobic to aerobic. There's a term called facultative, and it basically means that depending on the conditions, certain microbes can operate in both capacities. And what you find through that process of not turning it is that you're giving the microbes more life experience, if you will. It's how biodynamic compost is made. It's made passively, sometimes buried in barrels, but it's not turned. Whereas like what you find sold as compost around me is turned every hour, is steamed, it's manufactured mechanically rather than biologically. So don't fret if you can't turn the compost. And what you would want to focus on is making sure that what you put in there, even if it's just a layered approach, is about a 2-to-1 by volume of carbon to nitrogen. We're going to have a compost talk. I don't know how many weeks it'll be at this point, but within the next month, we'll get into some real detail in regards to composting that I think will help you a lot. But the main thing is to make sure that it's inoculated. The diversity of microbes that are really required to make high quality compost are not default there in your landscape unless you're extremely lucky. And even in that case, there's no harm in bringing more of them, So my suggestion is to search out a diverse compostee outlet. At the least, just go out into the virgin forest and scratch the forest floor and bring that back and maybe grow that up with some molasses. But make sure you've accessed the natural source of microbes to inoculate your pile. And as long as you don't clean that situation out, you could leave 5 gallons of that you finished for the next batch, and that's the mother that inoculates going forward. But turning, it happened all the time in progressive gardens. People would come in and they were doing all the right motions of composting, but they weren't getting the heat that you should get. They were getting real soggy compost. They hadn't inoculated it. And a lot of times, I could think of 3 or 4 right off the top of my head. People were doing all of these things and they had bins, kind of like what you're describing. And they had reached the point where nothing else could happen because it was completely inert. They took a gallon of the tea I gave them home, put it on their compost pile, went and checked it the next day, and it lost like 30, 40% of its volume overnight because it reaches that precipice of like, I can't melt here, guys. Where is the guys that do all the work? And as soon as you introduce them, it's boom. These microbes are just exploding. One bacteria can be 300 million more at the end of the day. Can't even think about this stuff, it's pretty wild. So make sure that you're inoculating it. If you do, then you don't have to turn it. And the only reason you would turn it is just to speed the process up if you wanted to use it quicker.
And would you say that's like a daily inoculation?
No, in a compost pile, I would say it's once. And there is justification to bring the tea consistently because you're bringing a population that the pile itself can't muster, right? So you're bringing in like reinforcements perpetually. It's going to speed that process up really effectively. But in order to do it efficiently, you don't have to do it more than once. If you did want to do it every time, I'd probably say for a compost pile, maybe once a month. If you're talking about tired soil that needs to be grown, then ideally you do it once a week. Once a month still efficient, but that's where the construction worker analogy comes in. The more often you can bring them, the more you bring at one time, the faster they're going to correct the soil environment.
Yeah, it's actually, there's a similar thing here at Wheaton Labs. They have one of those pipes with a big compost pile. They pee on it. They have a thing where it's a bridge around the compost pile.
No
and pees on it.
That's fantastic. And that's totally relevant, And so, do this. If you're into composting, search up, how to tend a compost pile and just read the first 3 or 4 links. You probably won't find the word microbe in there at all. And what you'll see is add some nitrogen fertilizer, like a straw bale garden, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what you're doing is the nitrogen stimulates biological growth, but the microbes have to be there to be stimulated. You know what I mean? So we're just one step beyond where we should be in terms of the actual process itself. And it's really frustrating because that's, you know, in general terms, carbon is energy for microbes and nitrogen is reproduction. So that high nitrogen fertilizer that you're using, and what you might also see is add a good cup of garden soil. Well, the assumption that they're making is that your garden is alive and diverse to begin with, like we've been sitting here talking about. It's not, you know, so we've just spinning our wheels. So that, you know, the fact that they're peeing on it's definitely helping. It's stimulating microbes, and I'm sure they've got good agronomy around there. They're probably having good results doing it. That's awesome.
All right, next question. We're gonna make this the last question, guys. We got Ben with another question. Ben says, what's the common nutrient profile of brewer's grain? I have access to 400 pounds a week for my birds. What other benefits or problems might this have?
I don't know. Good question. I've never investigated a nutrient profile of brewer's grain. If it's spent, I assume that it would be a good mulch input. I mean, just think generally about the success people have using wood chips in their soil. You know, there's a lot of anecdotes of people doing that out there. And so, you know, it's just good potential for the microbes to break down. As far as how it may work for or against you, it would be difficult to tell. And I've never really had a project that looked at that specifically based on their soil profile. But if it's something that you know, I assume we could take a soil test out of it. I've never really looked into it, but if you'd like to pursue it further, then shoot me a line and we'll see what we can't drum up.
All right. Thanks again, Ben. Another great show. And once again, guys, head over to tv.permethos.com. You'll see the last 3 episodes. I'll get this one up probably by the end of day tomorrow. And thanks again. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, y'all. Cheers.
All right. Bye.